She poked holes in his condoms to trap him for life, but when he found out, he left her in the dirt. Now, she just dumped a billionaire heir to crawl back to the man who ghosted her. Is this true love, or the most toxic obsession in Lagos history? You won't believe the cold-blooded move he made next. Stay tuned. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity of Lagos in November 2020 had a way of clinging to the skin like an unwanted memory, but David always looked as though he were living in a climate-controlled vacuum. He sat at the corner table of a leafy Iki cafe, his eyes shielded by dark shades, moving with a calculated, rhythmic slow motion that drove the women around him to a state of quiet frenzy. He was the nonchalant king, a man whose emotional baseline was a steady, unbothered hum, making every small gesture, a tilt of the head, a smirk, a hand placed on a lower back, feel like a hard-won prize. Across from him sat Amara, a woman whose beauty was so aggressive it felt like a physical confrontation. She was an 8.5 on her worst days, a blend of traditional elegance and modern polish that made people stop talking when she entered a room. They were the couple that onlookers stared at with a mixture of envy and exhaustion. They looked like a movie poster for a life everyone wanted but few could afford. David's affection for her was real, but it was filtered through a lens of detachment that suggested he could walk away at any moment without dropping his coffee. For Amara, being with David was like trying to hold on to smoke. She came from semi-old money, enough to have the right pedigree, but not enough to feel truly secure in the shark-infested waters of the Nigerian elite. Her love for David was an all-consuming fire, a frantic need to be the one who finally cracked his stoic exterior and forced him to admit that he couldn't live without her. She spent her days curating a life that complemented his silence, becoming the perfect companion who never asked for too much, never complained about the late nights, and always looked like a trophy. Their relationship was a masterclass in aesthetic harmony. They were unproblematic, calm, and seemingly destined for a lifetime of quiet luxury. But beneath the surface, the semi-rich kid in Amara was terrified. She knew that in David's world, everything was replaceable, and her greatest fear was that one day he would wake up, look at her, and simply decide that the cute and calm era had reached its natural conclusion. This fear was the invisible third party in their relationship, a silent ghost that drove her to love him with a desperate, suffocating intensity that he never quite noticed. By mid-2021, the honeymoon phase had transitioned into a comfortable, albeit stagnant, domesticity. Amara had just finished her NYSC year, an era she spent mostly in David's high-rise apartment, playing the role of the devoted partner while her peers were out hunting for corporate ladders. The pressure began to seep in from the edges, from her mother's subtle comments about fertility windows over Sunday brunch, and from her friends who were starting to post diamond rings on their Instagram stories with captions about forever. Amara felt the shift in her social currency. She was no longer just the beautiful girl on David's arm. She was a woman whose biological and social deadlines were approaching. She began to view every dinner, every vacation, and every quiet morning as a potential stage for a proposal that never came. David remained maddeningly consistent, treating her with a gentle, distant kindness that provided everything except a commitment to the future. He would buy her the latest designer bags and take her to the most exclusive beach clubs, but the conversation always stopped short of hours and forever. The burden of being a semi-rich girl in Lagos is the constant need to prove you belong in the upper echelon, and for Amara, a ring from David was the only ticket that mattered. She watched him as he slept, marveling at the peace on his face, a peace she felt she didn't share. To David, they were good, and in his nonchalant philosophy, good didn't need to be tinkered with or formalized by contract. He didn't see the way her hands shook when she scrolled through wedding blogs, or the way she practiced her surprised face in the bathroom mirror. Her identity was becoming entirely subsumed by his existence, and the lack of a formal title, wife, fiancée, felt like a constant insult to her devotion. She began to realize that David wasn't just nonchalant. He was strategically stationary. He liked the life they had because it required nothing more than what he was already giving. Amara, however, was starting to feel like a guest in a life she had helped build, and the desperation to lock the door behind her was beginning to manifest as a dark, frantic energy that she hid behind her 8.510 smile. As they crossed the 2-year mark, the silence in their relationship began to feel heavy, like the air before a tropical storm. David still looked at her with that same calm admiration, but Amara began to interpret his silence as a form of emotional withholding. She started bringing up the topic of children, not directly, but through the peripheral lens of the future or one day. David would simply nod, offer a non-committal "yeah, maybe," and go back to his laptop, his focus always elsewhere, always on the next deal or the next game. He wasn't being mean. He was being himself. But to a woman who was looking for a sign, his lack of urgency felt like a slow-motion rejection. The social circle they moved in began to whisper. They were the cute couple, yes, but they were also the couple that stayed the same while the world around them evolved. Amara felt the sting of being the girlfriend for too long, a title that felt increasingly flimsy as she approached her mid-20s in a culture that prized the speed of the altar. The tension reached a tipping point during a weekend getaway to a private resort in Anagbi. Surrounded by the sound of the Atlantic and the smell of expensive sunblock, Amara tried to pivot the conversation toward the next step. She spoke about her cousins who were already on their second child, and about the stability she craved now that her service year was over. David listened, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses, and finally said, "Amara, why are we rushing? We have everything we need right here. Why change the rhythm when the song is perfect?" To David, it was a compliment, a testament to his satisfaction with her. To Amara, it was a death sentence for her dreams. She realized in that moment that David would never move unless he was pushed, and the nonchalance she once found attractive now felt like a wall of ice. That night, as the waves crashed against the shore, the first dark thought entered her mind, a thought about how to bridge the gap between maybe and now. It was a seed of betrayal, planted in the fertile soil of her desperation, and it was the first day she stopped being the unproblematic girl he thought he knew. Returning to the city, the atmosphere in their apartment shifted from serene to stifling. Amara decided to drop the cool girl act, replacing it with a series of structured discussions that David increasingly viewed as interrogations. She began to point out that her parents were asking questions, that her semi-rich status didn't protect her from the gossip of aunts who wondered why a girl of her caliber hadn't been claimed yet. She presented her love as a commodity that was nearing its expiration date, hoping to trigger a fear of loss in him. But David's nonchalance was his greatest defense. He didn't respond with anger or defensiveness, but with a terrifyingly calm logic. If you're unhappy because of what people are saying, then you're not actually unhappy with me, he reasoned, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. He told her he loved her, that he valued her, but he refused to be pressured into a life stage he wasn't ready for just to satisfy a social script. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday evening over dinner she had spent 3 hours preparing. She told him, point blank, that she needed to know where this was going, either a ring or a baby, something that anchored them together beyond a shared lease and a Netflix password. David looked at her, his fork suspended in midair, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that wasn't nonchalance. It was disappointment. He told her that he didn't believe in ultimatums, that they were the antithesis of the calm and cute life they had built. He didn't say no, but he didn't say yes, leaving her in a purgatory of her own making. Amara realized then that she could not win a war of words with a man who didn't care about losing the argument. If she wanted to secure her place in his life, she would have to bypass his logic and appeal to his biology. She went to bed that night with a cold resolve, her mind already working through the logistics of a plan that would ensure he could never walk away, no matter how nonchalant he claimed to be. The psychology of a woman who decides to sabotage her own future is a complex landscape of love and madness. Amara didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a gardener, forcing a bloom that was taking too long. She began to research the accidental pregnancies of the Lagos elite, stories whispered in beauty salons about women who trapped their way into empires. To her, a baby wasn't a burden. It was a tether, an unbreakable cord that would tie David's nonchalant soul to her own forever. She began to visualize the life they would have, the baby showers, the naming ceremonies, the way David would finally have to look her in the eye and acknowledge her as the mother of his legacy. The 8.510 girl who had everything on the surface felt like she had nothing underneath, and the void was being filled by a frantic, jagged need for permanence. She stopped seeing David as a partner and started seeing him as a target, someone to be managed rather than loved. The first time she took the pen to the drawer where he kept the condoms, her hands didn't even shake. There was a clinical precision to her madness, a sense that she was merely correcting a mistake that the universe had made. She knew David's routine, how he would reach into the nightstand without looking, his movements fluid and practiced even in the dark. She chose the ones at the back, the ones he would get to in a week or two, giving herself time to build the narrative of a miracle. She felt a strange sense of power as she worked, a feeling that for the first time in their relationship, she was the one in control. David was the king of nonchalance, but she was the queen of the domestic sphere, and she was about to rewrite the rules of their engagement. As she tucked the evidence back into its place, she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The beauty was still there, but the calm and cute girl had been replaced by a predator in silk pajamas, waiting for the trap to spring. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Amara became the most attentive, loving version of herself, creating an atmosphere of such domestic bliss that David actually began to relax. He thought she had accepted his wait-and-see approach, and in his relief, he became more affectionate, more present. They spent long nights talking about everything and nothing. The shadow of the ultimatum seemingly vanished. But every time they were intimate, Amara was hyper-aware of the tiny, invisible perforations she had created. She felt like she was carrying a secret bomb, counting down the seconds until the explosion that would change everything. She began to track her cycle with obsessive detail, ensuring that their most passionate moments aligned with her most fertile windows. To David, it was just a period of renewed spark. To Amara, it was a tactical operation. The irony of her plan was that the more she succeeded in being the perfect girl, the more she hated the role. She was living a lie that required constant maintenance, a performance that was slowly hollowing her out from the inside. She watched David as he laughed at a joke, or as he thoughtfully brought her favorite snacks, and a part of her felt a pang of guilt. He was a good man, in his own detached way, and she was preparing to upend his entire reality without his consent. But then she would remember the coldness of his why rush, and the guilt would be swallowed by a wave of righteous anger. She told herself she was doing this for them, for the family they were meant to have. She convinced herself that once the baby was there, David would realize he had wanted this all along. She was betting their entire future on a delusion, guided by the belief that a man's nonchalance could be cured by the weight of a child. David wasn't a genius, but he was observant. His nonchalance wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a choice to remain unruffled by the world. However, he began to notice a shift in the air of their apartment, a certain heaviness in Amara's eyes that didn't match her upbeat demeanor. She was too perfect, too agreeable. It was as if she were overcompensating for something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He noticed the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, a look of intense, almost predatory calculation. He also noticed that she had stopped bringing up marriage or the future entirely, a 180-degree turn that felt unnatural given how intense a pressure had been just a month prior. A seed of unease began to grow in his gut, a quiet voice telling him that the peace they were experiencing was the eye of a hurricane. One evening, while looking for a charging cable on the nightstand, he noticed the box of condoms had been moved. It was a small thing. David was a creature of habit and noticed when his sanctuary had been disturbed. He didn't think much of it first, assuming Amara had just been tidying up. But a few days later, he noticed a tiny piece of plastic foil on the floor, a fragment that looked jagged, as if it had been torn with intent rather than haste. The nonchalant man began to pay attention. He started watching her more closely, noticing the way she hovered near the bedroom when he was getting ready, her eyes darting to the drawer. The trust that had been the foundation of their unproblematic relationship began to fray. He didn't want to believe that the girl he admired for her calmness could be capable of something so deceptive, but the logic of his mind was starting to override the comfort of his heart. The discovery didn't happen in a moment of cinematic drama. It happened in the cold, clinical light of a Sunday afternoon while Amara was out at her parents' house. David sat on the edge of the bed, the drawer open, holding a single foil packet up to the sunlight streaming through the window. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he squeezed the packet gently, and a tiny, almost invisible bead of air escaped from a microscopic puncture. His heart, usually so steady, skipped a beat. He tried another one, and another. Each one was the same, a neat, intentional hole that rendered the protection useless. The betrayal hit him not as a wave of heat, but as a freezing realization. The woman he had shared his bed with for 2 years, the woman who claimed to love him more than life itself, had been systematically sabotaging his autonomy. He felt a profound sense of violation, a feeling that his very future had been stolen from him in his sleep. This wasn't just about a baby. It was about the fundamental destruction of trust. He looked around the room, the photos of them in Paris, the expensive jewelry he'd bought her, the shared books, and it all felt like a stage set for a horror movie. He realized that every moment of renewed spark over the last month had been a calculated attempt to impregnate him against his will. The nonchalance that had defined his life evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He didn't pack his bags. He didn't scream. He simply sat in the silence of the apartment, the punctured packets lined up on the duvet like tiny, silver tombstones, waiting for the girl who was an 8.5 on the outside, but a stranger on the inside to come home. When Amara walked through the door, humming a tune and carrying a bag of groceries, she found David sitting exactly where he had been for 3 hours. The atmosphere was so thick with tension she nearly choked on it. "David, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice still maintaining the practiced, sweet tone. He didn't answer. He simply pointed to the bed. Amara's gaze followed his finger, and the color drained from her face so fast she had to grab the doorframe for support. The 8.5 beauty crumbled into a mask of pure terror. There was no room for denial. The evidence was laid out with a surgical coldness that was more terrifying than a shouting match. For a long minute, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant honking of Lagos traffic. "How could you?" David's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mountain. The explosion didn't come from him. It came from her. Realizing she was caught, Amara bypassed guilt and went straight to a hysterical justification. She screamed that he had forced her hand, that his nonchalance was a form of emotional abuse, and that she was only trying to save them. She threw her bag. She wept. She fell to her knees and clawed at his jeans, begging him to understand that it was all for love. David watched her with a look of profound disgust. The calm and cute facade was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation that made him wonder if he had ever known her at all. He didn't argue. He didn't offer a rebuttal. He simply stood up, stepped over her shaking form, and walked out of the apartment with nothing but his phone and his car keys. The breakup wasn't a conversation. It was an extraction. The weeks following the breakup were a public spectacle that the Lagos gossip mill feasted on for months. Amara, unable to accept the finality of David's departure, went on a scorched earth campaign of reconciliation. She called his mother, his sister, his best friends, and even his business associates, sobbing into the phone about a misunderstanding and her unbreakable love. She sent him hundreds of messages, ranging from suicidal threats to promises that she would wait 10 years for him to forgive her. She sat outside his office in her Mercedes, her eyes red and puffy, looking like a ghost of the girl she used to be. The semi-rich kid status no longer mattered. She was willing to trade every ounce of her dignity for a single text back from the man who had become her entire world. David, however, had gone completely dark. He blocked her on every platform, changed his locks, and moved into a temporary service apartment whose location he shared with no one. He felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The nonchalance was back, but it was harder now, a suit of armor designed to keep out the world. He watched from a distance as she made a fool of herself, feeling a cold pity but no desire to return. He realized that her love was a form of possession, a hunger that would never be satisfied. When her father finally reached out to him to settle things like men, David simply told him, "Your daughter tried to steal my life. There is nothing to settle." By the end of 2022, the It couple was a cautionary tale, and Amara was left standing in the ruins of a plan that had cost her everything. As 2023 dawned, the silence between them became an ocean. David had effectively erased Amara from his reality, focusing entirely on a new tech venture that required him to travel between Lagos and London. He found a strange solace in the work. The clean lines of code and the predictable logic of venture capital were a welcome respite from the chaotic, perforated reality of his last relationship. He became even more detached, his nonchalant reputation growing into a legendary coolness that made him a formidable negotiator. He wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a return on investment, building a fortress of wealth that would ensure no one could ever manipulate him again. He heard fragments of news about Amara, that she was depressed, that she had gone to London for a while, that she was moving on, but he filed it away like junk mail. For Amara, the ghosting was a slow, agonizing death. Every day that passed without a word from him was a fresh rejection. She spent months analyzing every second of their relationship, trying to find the moment where she could have done things differently. She haunted the places they used to go, hoping for a chance encounter, but Lagos is a big city for those who want to be lost. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, felt like a burden. Men still flocked to her, but she saw them all as pale imitations of the man who had walked away. She eventually reached a point of exhaustion where the tears ran dry, replaced by a hollow, cynical resolve. If she couldn't have a man she loved, she would have a life she was supposed to have. She began to re-enter the social scene, not as the girl in love, but as a woman looking for a strategic exit from her pain. Midway through 2023, Amara met Femi. Femi was everything David wasn't. He was loud, he was immensely wealthy, and he was absolutely enamored with her from the moment they met at a wedding in Dubai. Femi didn't have a nonchalant bone in his body. He showered her with gifts, attention, and the kind of security that her semi-rich upbringing had always craved. To the world, it looked like Amara had one. She had traded a struggling, detached guy for a billionaire heir who worshipped the ground she walked on. She played the part of the happy bride-to-be with the skill of a seasoned actress, her 8.510 beauty now draped in even more expensive fabrics and diamonds. But inside, the winter continued. Femi's love was easy, but it was shallow. He loved the idea of her, the beautiful socialite on his arm, but he didn't know the woman who had once stood over a bed with a pen in her hand. Amara found herself constantly comparing Femi's booming laughter to David's quiet smirk, Femi's frantic text to David's intentional silence. She felt like she was living someone else's life, a gilded existence that was comfortable but lacked the electricity she had shared with David. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that peace was better than passion, and that a billionaire husband was a fair trade for a broken heart. She accepted Femi's proposal in a highly publicized event that trended on Nigerian Twitter for days, cementing her status as one of the most envied women in the country. The preparations for the wedding of the year were a whirlwind of excess. Amara's life became a series of fittings in Paris, tastings in Lagos, and guest list disputes that spanned 3 continents. Femi was a generous fiancé, giving her a blank check to create the wedding of her dreams. Her family was ecstatic. The semi-rich girl had successfully climbed the final rung of the social ladder. Amara smiled for the cameras, posed for the glossy magazines, and played the role of the blushing bride. She was safe. She was secure. She was bored out of her mind. The gilded cage was beautiful, but the bars were made of Femi's constant, needy affection, which felt stifling after years of David's independence. She began to have episodes of nostalgia, scrolling through old, archived photos of 2020. She wondered where David was, if he'd seen the news, if he cared. The nonchalant man remained a ghost, his social media dormant, his life a mystery. This lack of closure was a rot at the center of her new life. She had everything she had ever asked for, a ring, a future, a wealthy husband, but it felt like ashes in her mouth because it hadn't come from him. She found herself hoping, in the dark corners of her mind, that David would see her success and finally realize what he had lost. She wanted him to be jealous, to be hurt, to reach out and beg for her to come back. It was a dangerous fantasy, one she kept hidden behind the lace of her Vera Wang gown. While Amara was planning her royal wedding, David was experiencing a rise of his own. The tech startup he had poured his soul into had been acquired by a global conglomerate in a multi-million-dollar deal. Almost overnight, David went from doing well to never having to work again. The nonchalant man now had the power to match his personality. He moved into a sprawling penthouse in Banana Island, his life a curated collection of art, silence, and high-stakes investments. He had become the bachelor of the Lagos business world, a man of mystery and immense liquidity. He had processed the trauma of Amara's betrayal and turned it into fuel, building a life where no one could ever hold a need over his head again. He saw the news of Amara's engagement, of course. He saw the photos of her and Femi, looking like the pinnacle of Nigerian success. He felt a strange, detached amusement. He knew Femi, a man who bought what he couldn't earn, and he knew Amara. He knew the desperation that lived under her skin, and he knew that Femi would never be able to satisfy it. David was now financially stable, emotionally clear, and possessed a level of confidence that was bordering on predatory. He realized that for the first time in his life, he held all the cards. He didn't need Amara, but he found himself curious about the what-if. He wondered if the girl who had poked holes in his condoms would still be willing to bleed for him now that he was the man she had always wanted him to be. It happened on a Tuesday, exactly 2 years since the day he walked out. Amara was at a high-end spa, having her skin prepped for the upcoming introduction ceremony, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Usually, she ignored such calls, but a strange instinct made her answer. The flowers in the Ikoyi Cafe are in bloom again. I thought you'd like to know. The voice was low, calm, and unmistakably David's. Amara felt the world tilt on its axis. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The nonchalance in his tone, as if they had just spoken yesterday, was a physical blow. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply dropped a tether into her soul and waited for her to grab it. In that single moment, the billionaire fiancé, the Paris fittings, and the social standing vanished. She was 2020 Amara again, desperate, in love, and utterly at the mercy of the man who had ghosted her into oblivion. The call was followed by a text. I'm at the Penthouse. Come if you want. Don't if you're happy. It was the ultimate nonchalant move, a low-pressure invitation that put the entire burden of betrayal on her. Amara spent the next 6 hours in a state of near paralysis. She looked at her massive engagement ring, the symbol of the life she had fought so hard to build. Then she looked at the text message. She knew that going to see him was madness. She knew it was a trap, but the curiosity gap he had created was too wide to ignore. She needed to see him, to show him how well she was doing, to get the closure she never had. At least, that's what she told herself as she lied to her security detail and drove her car toward Banana Island. Walking into David's penthouse was like walking into a different dimension. The wealth was palpable, but it was quiet, understated wealth, the kind that didn't need a shout. David stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the Lagos lagoon, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked older, sharper, and infinitely more powerful. He didn't turn around when she entered. He just said, "You look good, Amara. Femi's money suits you." The jab hit home, reminding her that he knew her better than anyone. He knew she was a semi-rich kid playing at being a queen. The chemistry between them, dormant for 2 years, ignited instantly, filling the room with a tension that made the air feel electric. That night, the conversation wasn't about the past, at least not at first. They talked about his success, her wedding, and the hollow nature of the Lagos social scene. David was magnetic, his nonchalance now seasoned with a dark, sophisticated wit. He treated her not like an ex, but like a fascinating stranger he was considering investing in. Amara found herself talking more than she had in months, pouring out the frustrations of her perfect life with Femi. She realized how much she had missed the intellectual challenge of David, the way he made her feel like she had to earn his attention. Femi gave her everything, and it made her feel like a pet. David gave her nothing, and it made her feel alive. As the night wore on, the topic finally turned to the betrayal. David didn't yell. He simply asked, was it worth it? The holes? The lies? Amara broke down the 8-5-10 mask finally shattering. She admitted everything, the fear, the pressure, the madness. She expected him to kick her out. Instead, he walked over and traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. I was never going to leave you, Amara. I was just waiting for you to trust me. It was a lie, or perhaps a half-truth, but in her vulnerable state, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. When he kissed her, it wasn't a reconciliation, it was a reclamation. She left the penthouse at 3 a.m., her mind a chaotic blur of guilt and ecstasy, knowing that she could never go back to being Femi's perfect bride. The following week was a descent into psychological hell. Every time Femi touched her, she recoiled inwardly, his presence now feeling like an intrusion. Femi was a good man, but he was a simple man. He didn't see the shadows in her eyes. He only saw the reflection of his own wealth. David, meanwhile, continued his nonchalant assault, sending her small, cryptic messages that kept her in a state of constant agitation. He was playing a game of emotional chess, and Amara was losing every piece. She began to see her life with Femi as a prison sentence, a life of safety that would eventually kill her spirit. She met David 2 more times in secret. Each time, he showed her a different side of his new life, the influence he wielded, the freedom he had, the way he still understood her in a way no one else could. He never asked her to leave Femi. He never made a promise of marriage. He simply existed as a superior alternative, a reminder of what real passion looked like. Amara found herself caught in a narrative loop. She had sabotaged her relationship with David to get a marriage, and now she was sabotaging her marriage to get back to David. The irony was not lost on her, but the pull of the past was too strong. She was addicted to the nonchalant king, and she was willing to burn down a billionaire's empire to get another fix. The introduction ceremony was supposed to be the social event of the season. The marquee was set, the champagne was on ice, and the most powerful people in Nigeria were in attendance. Amara sat in her dressing room, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists, looking like a goddess. But as she looked at her reflection, she didn't see Femi's wife. She saw the girl who had poked holes in a condom in a desperate bid for a man who now sat in a penthouse waiting for her to make a choice. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She couldn't do it. She couldn't spend the rest of her life pretending. The fallout was nuclear. Amara walked out of the ceremony before it even began, leaving Femi standing in front of the elders and the cameras. She didn't offer a long explanation. She simply said she couldn't go through with it. The scandal rocked the Lagos elite, turning her into a pariah overnight. Her parents were devastated, her friends were horrified, and Femi was humiliated on a national scale. But as she drove away from the venue, she felt a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. She drove straight to Banana Island, to the only man who had ever truly seen her, for better or for worse. She had sacrificed her reputation, her security, and her family standing for a chance at a man who had once ghosted her without a second thought. The final scene of the drama unfolded 6 months later. The dust had settled on the Femi scandal, replaced by a new, even more shocking development. A wedding invitation began to circulate on WhatsApp and Instagram, a minimalist, elegant card embossed with gold leaf. David and Amara. Finally, the irony was delicious and dark. The couple everyone had written off, the couple defined by betrayal and nonchalance, was actually doing it. They were getting married. The 8.510 girl and the man who didn't care had finally found their way back to the altar. As the wedding day approached, the onlookers wondered, was this a story of true love or a story of mutual destruction? David had come into money, and Amara had come back to him the moment he did. David had forgiven a woman who tried to trap him. Or perhaps he had simply decided that a woman who would go to such lengths was the only one who could match his own darkness. They stood at the altar in a private ceremony, David looking as nonchalant as ever, and Amara looking more beautiful and more relieved than she had ever been. As they exchanged rings, a guest noticed a small, subtle smile on David's face, a smile that suggested he had won a game no one else even knew was being played. The perforated promise was finally sealed, leaving the world to wonder if the holes were ever truly patched, or if they were just hidden under the weight of a very expensive, very public I do. She chose the man who hated her over the man who gave her the world, and now their wedding invite is the biggest scandal in the country. Is she a genius, or just a victim of her own trap? If you think he's only back for revenge, comment karma below. Follow for the honeymoon disaster.